I'd like to continue our discussion about racism, the teaching of that in classrooms, and the teaching of diversity, and some of the difficulties involved in that, some of the challenges, and some of the goals and principles. The regents have issued some guidelines about this in terms of New York State, and I think these are guidelines and ideas that would be good in terms of other localities throughout our country and actually throughout the world. What is the goal of this teaching? What is this diversity, this racism teaching supposed to accomplish? And the goal, according to the regents, is very much student-centered learning environments. That when you are teaching these concepts, what you're trying to do is center around that individual student and how they can learn and how they can absorb this, what their questions, what their concerns might be. And so I think one of the concerns of parents is that you're forcing a certain teaching on students. And I think this goal of the student-centered learning environment is important, that you're not going to indoctrinate the student, that you're going to try to have a dialogue with them about these concepts. And very much in this type of student-centered approach, what you're trying to do is to affirm the racial and cultural identities. That very much this is your cultural identity. This is where you come from. This is your background. And how does it relate to somebody maybe of a different background? How can you be in dialogue and discussion with someone whose experience, whose traditions, whose celebrations, for example, religious holidays, might be very different from yours? What would be the comparisons? What would be the distinctives? That would be a very healthy discussion, certainly, to have. And a part of this goal is to develop students' abilities to connect across cultures. All of us, of course, are limited by our certain cultural identity and perspective. We grow up in a certain household. We're used to doing things in a certain way. Well, what are the traditions that you have grown up with? And how do your traditions interact with mine? So part of this teaching about racism, about cultural diversity, is to say, well, we are a diverse country. We have different groups, and it's good and healthy for me to learn about, your traditions. So, for example, as a Native American, how do you reverence the earth? What are some of the things you can teach me about the environment that I can apply to my life? So that I will be more respectful and a better steward of the environment. Certainly that would be helpful. Um, Students really can become agents of social change, and that is another goal. That if in this discussion it comes out that there's a certain inequity, a certain injustice, then as a student, what can I do to change that? Certainly, it would be appropriate at certain grade levels. You can't picture maybe a first grade student getting out on a picket line or something of that for a certain change. But it's interesting to me. A story that really made an impact in my life was a fifth grade student in the Philadelphia area who had learned in school about homelessness, and of course was reinforced in his home and his own reading on it, and decided to do something. And what he did was he decided to help the homeless and actually develop this whole organization, even as a fifth grader, of reaching out with food to those who are homeless. So simple things like sandwiches, getting people to drop food for those that were homeless to help them, and to realize that, there but for the grace of God go I, that I could be in that situation, and that I have an obligation to help my brothers and sisters. Now, certainly, you don't want to do that in a way that would overwhelm someone, but to give them the opportunity to look at some of these issues and to say what I can do. I remember our own daughter, one of the things that she decided to do was to take her money that she had saved and to bring it up to the parish outreach to help those that were in need. And again, it was just our discussion and things that she had learned in school, obviously, about those who were in need. But again, her own initiative. So it's student centered. It's that individual student, what they want to do, not laying guilt upon them as such, but telling them that these are some of the issues and that we can do things about them. We can make a positive difference in our communities. Many schools, for example, have food drives, clothing drives, these types of things that where the student is reaching out and helping other students, and in that way, agents for social change. Not in a way that would overwhelm them or certainly make them feel guilty or responsible for the fact that they are homeless or all of these social problems, but a way that would give them a means to express their love, their compassion. So you can see the fine balance here that as an educator you have to develop. You don't want to impact students in a negative way, certainly, and that's a genuine concern that many parents have expressed. But you don't want to ignore the reality of the situation either. So you want to present it in a balanced way that is helpful to the students. And you also want to offer them as a teacher, and certainly as parents, your support, your encouragement, so that you are working in harmony, in unity with what they're learning, certainly in the schools. And finally, another goal that's a very important goal is to cultivate critical thinking. One of the main goals is to look at different sources and different claims and to say, well, is the factual basis for that? So many parents, for example, will say, well, there is no such thing as structural racism. And certainly you look at that issue and say, well, what do you mean by structural racism? What are some examples of it? What would be some specific ways that these structures are embracing racism? How can we deal with that? You develop those critical thinking skills. This is so important because it avoids one of the main problems that we want to address here, and that is indoctrination. We don't want to come across and say, well, you must believe this, you must believe in structural racism, you must believe in this and that. No, you want to say, well, let's look at this issue and see, what are those who are advocating that there is structural racism, what are they bringing forth to back that claim up? What are the specific areas that manifest structural racism, and how can those be addressed? And this is so important in terms of critical thinking, so that you avoid propaganda, you avoid indoctrination, and you allow students to develop sensitivity to other people, to their needs, but to do it in a way where they can analyze and take various points of view and information sources and balance it out, and of course come to their own conclusion. You never want to be in a situation where a student is just a puppet of a teacher or indeed a puppet of a parent, right? Even as a parent, your goal ultimately is that your child will be an independent person. They will be their own person. They're not necessarily always going to echo, your own views, your own sentiments on things. And I think that's important in terms of developing those skills that are necessary. Many times I've had discussions with my own children. Well, they'll have a different point of view, and we'll have that. Well, what are the facts behind that, and how do we get to that, and what sources do we use? All of those discussions, very healthy discussions, very important discussions to have. And so the regents, in their guidelines in terms of teaching about racism and cultural diversity, these would be the goals that they would put forth. And I think those goals are significant goals and important goals, and goals that I think alleviate, to a certain extent, some of the concerns that parents might have. And in the next part, we'll go into that a little bit further.